Welcome back to the Quickstart Guide for Recovery from Addiction and Co-occurring Disorders. In this unit, we're going to continue talking about preventing and mitigating negative triggers. Remember that triggers can be physical, affective, cognitive, emotional, or relational. In this unit, we're going to talk about your affective triggers, ways to prevent and mitigate them, and steps to remind yourself to actually do your prevention activities. A relapse prevention plan isn't any good unless you actually do it. No matter how good it looks on paper, unless you actually do it, it's not going to be very helpful. Affective triggers are those emotions that make you feel like you want to use, or if we're talking about mental health issues, they are the emotions that may trigger a relapse or a flare-up, if you will, of your depression or your anxiety or your anger. It's important to recognize that emotions do not occur in isolation. Typically, we have multiple emotions. The emotion that we display outwardly is generally the emotion that we're most comfortable with. But there are a lot of other emotions intertwined. In this first activity, I want you to take a sheet of paper and draw 4 columns. And in each column, you are going to identify how different feelings, different affects can trigger different problems. So in the first column, you're going to label addiction. The second, depression, the third, anxiety, and the fourth, anger. And then in each column, I want you to think about how anger, envy, jealousy, guilt, grief, loneliness, anxiety, impulsivity, helplessness, hopelessness, and depression, how those things can impact either addiction, depression, anxiety, or anger, whatever column you happen to be in. So for example, addiction. A lot of people may self-medicate when they start feeling angry. When they start feeling envious or jealous, they may just want to numb that feeling out. When they start feeling lonely, when they're detoxing, for example, and their anxiety levels go up, or when something happens and their anxiety levels go up. We know that distress is a big trigger for addiction relapse. So that might be one of the easier columns to do. So do that one first. The next column is depression. And you may be thinking, how are these things related? Depression is a state that we get to when we feel hopeless and helpless, when we feel like there is just so much threat out there, there is so much lack of ability to feel happy, to feel good anymore, that, we just kind of give up in a way. Let's talk about depression and some of these other affects. For example, if somebody is angry, a lot of the time. When we're angry, we tend to notice the negative things in the environment. And the more that you notice in the environment, the more that you notice in your life that's negative, the more angry you may get. But it also may contribute to feeling depressed after a while. When you're looking around and all you're seeing is the negative, that can be really oppressive and depressing to people. People who, are envious or jealous of other people. That can contribute to depression because you may look at them and say, why not me? And that contributes to a feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. Guilt, we know, is one of those things when we feel guilty. Guilt is anger at ourselves for something that we did that we shouldn't have, or something that we didn't do that we should have. And when we're thinking about guilt, if people feel guilty a lot of the time, they also may feel hopeless and helpless to redeem themselves. Grief. The stages of grief involve denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So grief itself is going to have aspects of depression and anger in it. Loneliness, you can see how that can trigger depression. That's, easy peasy. Anxiety is similar to anger. When people are anxious for too long, then it can trigger a sense of depression, a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. They're looking around. They're not seeing any relief. They're not seeing any happy. Then you can go to the next column, which is anxiety. Go through each one of these 8 affects. And again, identify how each affect may contribute to or make your anxiety worse. And then in the 4th column, do the same exact thing for each one of these 8 affects and think about how they can contribute to making your anger worse. Once you've finished with that, that should take, 20 minutes the first time you go through it. You may go through it a couple of times. I want you to go back and think about how you can prevent or cope with each one of these 8 different affects. When you get angry, what are 3 ways that you can cope with it, and maybe 3 ways that you can prevent it? There are certain things like if you tend to get road rage and you don't deal well in, heavy traffic, or you get really irritable when you've got to wait in line at the grocery store. Guess what? One of the things that you can do to prevent getting angry is not drive during rush hour and go shopping when it's not the peak time for shopping. So there are different things that you can do to prevent some of these emotions and other things you can do to mitigate it or deal with it when it happens. Maybe you have to drive in rush hour traffic at some particular time. You don't have to do it every day, but on a particular occasion to get to a meeting across town, you have to drive through lunch hour traffic. And that's really stressful for you, and it causes you to start feeling irritable and stressed out. How can you mitigate that anger? How can you help yourself remember to breathe or do whatever it is in order to prevent yourself from escalating and creating a situation where you feel enraged? The third thing that I want you to do is to go back and identify the benefits and drawbacks to holding on to each one of these emotions. We hold on to these emotions for a reason. A lot of times it's because in some way it makes us feel safer. Sometimes we may feel, quote, we deserve it. We may feel like we deserve to be punished. So we feel like we should, quote unquote, hold on to our guilt because we did something wrong. But I want you to look at the benefits and the drawbacks to it. What's the benefit to holding on to anger? Now remember, emotions are very natural things. So when they occur, that's your body's way of telling you, hey, pay attention, something needs to happen. If it's a happy emotion, we want to do it again. If it is an unpleasant emotion, it's your body telling you that there may be a threat out there. You need to check it out and see if something needs to change. I don't want you to believe that you shouldn't feel these emotions ever. Feeling emotions is natural and normal and kind of essential. But holding on to them, nurturing them, carrying them around with you like a rucksack every day, that may not be so helpful. So what is the benefit to holding on to anger, to nurturing grudges, to holding on to envy and jealousy at other people, whether it's friends or influencers or whomever? What are the benefits to holding on to guilt? As I said earlier, some people believe that they need to hold on to that guilt in order to punish themselves. But what's the benefit to holding on to that? Go through each of the 8 affects and identify the benefits to holding on to those emotions. And then go back over each of the 8 affects and identify the drawbacks to holding on to them. For example, if I hold on to anger, yes, in a way it may protect me because I remember, dangerous situations, or I remember that people may have lied to me or cheated me or something. That's true, possibly. But can I remember those things without holding on to that anger? Anger takes a lot of energy. And if I continue to hold on and nurture that anger, it not only takes a lot of energy to hold on to it, it's kind of like trying to walk Marmaduke on a leash, but it also causes me to notice when we're in a negative emotional state. We notice the negative far more than we notice the positive. So if I'm holding on to that anger, not only is it making me remember whatever it was that made me angry, but it's also causing me to pay a whole lot more attention to all the other negatives in the world and get even angrier, which is more draining. So, a lot of times holding on to anger for an extended period of time is not helpful. Go through each of the affects and identify the drawbacks to holding on to it. And what could you do with that energy if you freed it up? Instead of holding on to guilt, what could you do? Now, I'm not saying you can just make this decision, then all of a sudden, poof, you're not holding on to those emotions anymore. You'll need to develop skills and tools to deal with and work through the issues that are causing you to feel these emotions. But the first step is recognizing that, sometimes it's not beneficial to hold on and nurture these emotions. And the fourth thing that I want you to do is think about what can you do to remind yourself to do these prevention activities. So remember, in the second question was, how can you prevent some of these feelings from happening? Okay. You know how to prevent them. So what can you do to remind yourself to do those things in order to prevent relapse? Once you've gone through all of those, you're going to have a lot of techniques that you've identified to help reduce the impact of negative affects or negative emotions. Add those to your relapse prevention plan. Your emotions are the result of memories, thoughts, and behaviors that trigger a chemical surge. Your emotions, as I said earlier, are your brain's way of saying, hey, pay attention. If it's a good thing, we want to do it again. If it's a bad thing, we need to remember how to keep ourselves safe. When those emotions are unpleasant, they result in activation of the HPA axis, or your threat response system, which causes an increase in cortisol, your stress hormone, and adrenaline, and decreases your calming brain chemicals. So essentially, it's like stepping on the gas in your car and just flooring it. When this happens too often and you've not refueled, or there's no oil in the engine, you may start feeling exhausted or depressed. In early recovery, even before you start making your personal inventory, you will likely feel many, if not all, of the feelings that we discussed. It's important to have a plan for how to deal with these feelings so they don't result in relapse or worsening of your anxiety or depression.